Why was everyone ignoring her at the table? Steam rose gently from the paper cup in her trembling hands as she stepped through the doorway, the murmur of voices washing over her like a tide she didn't belong to. The room was full of uniforms, brass on collars catching the fluorescent light, the rustle of folders and clipped voices. To most of them, she was invisible. Just another young woman sent to deliver coffee, a shadow carrying warmth to men who carried the weight of decisions that sent others into the sky, into the fire. She balanced the tray carefully, her shoulders squared even as her pulse thudded hard in her neck. She hated the way her palms sweated when she entered rooms like this. She hated the way she could feel their eyes flicker over her and then away, dismissing her before she even placed the cups down. She told herself she didn't care, that she wasn't here for them. But the truth was heavier. It stung. Her breath caught when one of the pilots glanced up from his folder. His gaze froze, not on her face, but on her sleeve. That patch. For a second, the air itself seemed to thin. His eyes locked onto the small circle stitched carefully into the fabric of her uniform jacket. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't supposed to be there at all. A faded navy circle, the threads worn but deliberate, marked with a symbol that only a handful of men in that room would ever recognize. It wasn't just fabric. It was history, it was blood, it was sacrifice. The pilot's jaw tightened, his throat catching as though a ghost had just walked through the door. She felt it too, the sudden stillness that rippled through the room, the uneasy silence that prickled her skin. Her mind raced. Should she cover it, pretend it was nothing? But how could she? That patch was the only piece of her brother she had left. Her brother who had never come home. She had sewn it on quietly, almost guiltily, telling herself it was only for comfort, a way to keep him close when everything else felt so far. Never once had she imagined anyone would notice. Not here, not now, not surrounded by sharp eyes and sharper judgments. And yet the pilot, his eyes hardened by years in the sky, in places she would never be allowed to follow, looked at her as if she had just unraveled a secret meant to stay buried. He cleared his throat. The sound cut the air, and the men around the table straightened unconsciously, as though summoned. "Where did you get that?" His voice was even, calm, but beneath the words was something else, urgency, maybe even fear. Her fingers trembled as she set the tray down, the paper cups rattling softly against their cardboard holder. She swallowed hard. "It belonged to my brother," she whispered. Her voice wasn't meant to carry, but in the silence that had swallowed the room, every syllable landed with weight. He wore it on his last deployment. The room stilled. Papers no longer rustled. Pens froze above yellow legal pads. A low murmur swept through the officers, curiosity sharpening into something else. A heaviness, recognition. The pilot's expression shifted. A flicker of something like sorrow crossed his face, but it hardened almost immediately, as if memory and duty were colliding behind his eyes. He knew that patch. Everyone who had ever flown in his squadron knew it. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a call sign, a mark carried by a select few who had undertaken missions no one dared speak of outside the wire. Her brother hadn't just served. He had walked into fire that others would never name. And then the hardest truth struck him, the one he had buried for years. He had been there. He had seen the flames. He had heard the static on the comms, the last words that cut through the chaos. He had believed her brother was gone forever. Yet here she stood, carrying the proof of his sacrifice like a quiet flame sewn into her sleeve. His throat tightened. He thought he'd never face this moment, thought he'd never have to speak aloud what he had carried in silence all these years. But she was staring at him. Her eyes were wide, searching for what? Answers, closure, maybe even forgiveness. He inhaled slowly, steadying his voice against the weight of memory. "Your brother," the words faltered. His tone cracked before he caught it again, steadier but heavy. "He didn't just fight, he shielded us all. I'm alive because of him." Her knees weakened. The coffee cup slipped slightly in her grip before she set it down quickly, her breath sharp in her chest. For years she had lived with silence. For years the official reports had said only, missing in action. No details, no explanation, no finality, just a phrase that hovered over her family like smoke from a fire they could never put out. But now, in a single sentence, the truth opened before her. Her brother hadn't just vanished into the smoke. He had stood. He had chosen to protect. Tears stung her eyes, though she fought to keep them from falling. Around her, one by one, the officers rose quietly to their feet. No applause, no speeches, just the solemn sound of respect filling the room like a tide rising against the walls. And for the first time since the day her brother's absence became permanent, she felt the weight in her chest ease just slightly. His memory wasn't lost. It was living, here, in this pilot, in the men now standing silent in honor, in the faded thread sewn onto her sleeve. Because courage doesn't die. It echoes. It finds its way into hearts it once protected, and it resurfaces when you least expect it. She had entered the room as a girl carrying coffee. She left as the sister of a hero. But as she stepped into the hallway, her hands still trembling, she felt something else. Not just pride, not just grief, something heavier. Responsibility. Because the pilot's eyes had held more than gratitude. They had held something unspoken, something unfinished. And deep down, she knew the story wasn't over. Not for her. Not yet. What was it he hadn't told her? The words he had spoken, "I'm alive because of him," echoed in her mind long after she left the briefing room. They circled like the steady hum of a rotor blade, growing louder the more she tried to quiet them. He had said enough to crack open a truth, but not enough to close it. The hallway smelled faintly of jet fuel and old paper, the mix of a base that never really slept. She paused, pressing her palm flat against the cool wall as if she could steady herself through concrete. Around her, the shuffle of boots and the bark of clipped orders carried on, unbothered by what had just shifted inside her. To them she was no one, a junior airman with no clearance, no voice, just another shadow on the edge of the real war. But in that room, for those few minutes, everything had changed. Her brother's name wasn't supposed to be spoken here. It wasn't on the wall of heroes. It wasn't on any memorial she could visit with folded flowers and whispered prayers. His records had been swallowed by phrases like classified and pending confirmation. Her family had been left with silence, her mother clutching at folded flags as if they were anchors, her father drinking in the garage until the bottles outnumbered his words. And she had carried a patch, just thread and fabric, yet somehow heavier than her own beating heart. She remembered the night she sewed it on. A small lamp, the base dormitory quiet around her, her fingers clumsy with the needle. She hadn't cried, she never cried, not where anyone could see. But when she knotted the last stitch, her throat had ached like she'd swallowed fire. She told herself it was only for her, that no one would notice, that it was her secret. But secrets had a way of finding light. She could still see the pilot's face in her mind, the way his eyes had darkened when he saw it, the way his voice almost broke before he steadied it, as if he had just relived something he'd buried deep. He knew more. The thought gnawed at her as she walked across the base. She passed hangars where mechanics wiped grease from their hands, past the long stretch of tarmac where crews checked and rechecked their aircraft before another night's flight. Everything in motion, everything with purpose. Except her. Her boots felt heavy, dragging against the pavement. She hated the hollow ache that rose in her chest, the same ache that whispered, "You don't belong here. You'll never belong here." But another voice pushed back, a quieter one. "Then why did he look at you that way? Why did his words tremble?" She didn't realize she had wandered until she found herself near the edge of the flight line, staring at the silhouette of a C-130 against the fatting sky. The sun dipped low, the clouds streaked with amber, the sound of distant engines rolling over the horizon. She stood there, motionless, watching the world turn gold. And memory bled in. Her brother's laugh, loud, uncontained, echoed in her ears. The way he used to toss his cap onto the couch when he came home, always with dust on his boots. The smell of motor oil clinging to him no matter how many times their mother made him shower. "Don't ever let them tell you you can't stand where they stand," he once told her. She had been 12, scrawny and quiet, hiding behind a book when he dropped that line like it was the simplest truth in the world. Half the time, the only difference is who dares to walk forward. At the time, she had laughed. What did she know about daring? But he had believed it. He had lived it. And then he had vanished into silence, leaving her with nothing but echoes. The sound of footsteps behind her pulled her back. She turned quickly. It was him. The pilot. He approached with measured steps, his gaze steady, his hands clasped behind his back. Even out of uniform, he carried himself like someone used to the weight of command. There was no coffee tray now to hide behind, no crowded table between them. Just the open air and the low rumble of distant turbines. For a moment neither spoke. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Finally he said, "You shouldn't wear that patch." Her jaw tightened. She wanted to argue, to ask why it mattered, but the words snagged in her throat. "Why?" she managed. "Because people will ask questions." His tone wasn't unkind, just firm, like a door half shut. "Then answer them," she whispered before she could stop herself. Something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of pain. He glanced away, toward the horizon where the last of the light was fading. "Some answers aren't mine to give," he said quietly. Her chest clenched. She hated the way her voice wavered when she asked, "But you know what happened to him, don't you?" He didn't answer at first. He just breathed, slow and deliberate, as if each inhale carried the weight of years. Finally, he turned back to her. "I was there," he said, 3 words, heavy enough to crack the ground beneath her. Her throat closed. Her brother's last day, his final moments, were more than just a line on a report. They were here in the eyes of this man. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice breaking now, soft but unrelenting. He hesitated. She could see the battle behind his expression, the way his jaw clenched and released. "I saw him do what no one else could," he said finally. "I saw him stay when everyone else had to run." Her breath shuddered, the ache in her chest swelled. "But that's not the whole story," he added. Her eyes snapped up. "Then tell me." He looked at her as if weighing something invisible, as if deciding whether to hand her a weapon she wasn't ready to carry. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said. "Then make me understand." Silence stretched again, long enough that she thought he might walk away. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Your brother wasn't just on a mission. He was the mission. And if you're going to wear that patch, you need to know what that means." Her pulse hammered. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "What does it mean?" she demanded. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly, as though bracing against something he couldn't stop. "It means his story isn't finished." Her breath caught. She stared at him, waiting for him to say more. But he didn't. He turned, his footsteps heavy against the pavement, walking back into the fading light. She stood frozen, the words burning into her skin like fire. His story isn't finished. Her brother had been gone for years. She had grieved him, carried him in silence. Now, with a single sentence, the ground shifted beneath her. Gone, yet unfinished. Her throat tightened. For the first time, she felt something sharp beneath her grief. Not just loss, not just pride. Something else. Resolve. Because if the story wasn't finished, then she had to know why. And deep down, she already sensed the truth. Knowing would cost her more than she was ready to give. But she would give it anyway. Why couldn't he just tell her? The question clawed at her through the night, dragging her awake long after the base had gone quiet. She lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint rattle of pipes filling the silence. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, The pilot's face, lined with years she couldn't yet measure, his voice carrying weight he refused to release. Your brother wasn't just on a mission, he was the mission. She rolled onto her side, the mattress creaking softly, her hand brushing against her sleeve where the patch lay stitched into fabric. She traced its edges with her fingertip, thread, worn and frayed, but to her it was alive, pulsing like a heartbeat. How could something so small carry so much? Her chest ached with questions. What had her brother carried into that night? What had he left behind? She remembered the day the knock came. Two men in pressed uniforms, their eyes cast downward as her mother opened the door. She had been barely 20, standing just behind her mother, clutching a dish towel like it was armor. "Ma'am," one of them said softly, "your son is missing in action." Missing, the word had been a knife without blood, final yet unfinished. Her mother's cry tore through the house, sharp enough to silence even the dog. Her father didn't cry. He simply turned away, shoulders rigid as though bracing against a storm no one else could see. And she had stood frozen as though the floorboards themselves had turned to ice. She had listened to the rest of the words, procedures, condolences, promises of updates, and none of it had mattered. Only one thing stayed. Missing. Not dead, not alive. Just lost. And in the years since, she had carried that word like a ghost at her shoulder. She squeezed her eyes shut now, fighting the memory back, but it clung to her, heavy as breath. The pilot had said his story wasn't finished. Could that mean? She forced herself upright, sitting on the edge of the bed, pressing her palms to her knees. No, she couldn't let herself believe in miracles, not after this long. Not after the folded flag, the memorial service, the empty chair at every holiday dinner. Hope was than grief. But still, what if the truth was more than she'd been given? Her brother had always been more than words on a page. She remembered the way he teased her, the way he never let her win at cards, the way he once carried her home in the rain when her shoes filled with mud. He wasn't perfect. He was reckless, stubborn, sometimes careless with his words, but he was alive in ways that made the world feel less gray. And now she wanted to know who he had been out there, in the dust and fire. Not just the brother she knew at home, but the soldier others had followed. If the pilot knew, she would find a way to make him speak. The thought lit something inside her, a spark that spread, quiet but determined. The next morning she rose before dawn. The base was still half asleep, the air sharp with cold, the sky a dull slate before sunrise. She slipped into her uniform, smoothing the fabric over her shoulders, her fingers lingering for a moment on the patch. She walked across the compound, boots crunching against gravel, her breath puffing white in the air. She wasn't sure where she was going, only that she couldn't sit still. The pilot would be somewhere near the flight line. She knew his type, the kind who lived closer to the aircraft than to their own bunks, who carried the weight of the sky even when their feet were on the ground. But when she reached the hangar, it was quiet. Only a lone mechanic crouched by a wheel, muttering into his radio. She hesitated, her pulse quickening. Should she ask for him, track him down directly? But something inside warned her to wait, to move slower. Instead, she turned away, wandering the edges of the base until she found herself near the records building. A small, nondescript structure, windows shuttered, a guard standing stiff at the entrance. She slowed, her eyes lingering on the door. She had never been inside. She didn't have clearance. But the thought pressed at her, what if the answers were there? Reports, logs, anything that told the truth about her brother's last mission. She stood for too long, her gaze fixed on the door, until the guard glanced at her suspiciously. She quickly moved on, her cheeks burning. Not yet, not like this. Back in the dormitory, she sat on her bunk, restless. The day dragged on, briefings and drills filling the air with clipped commands, laughter spilling from mess halls where she felt no place to sit. She moved through it all like a ghost, her mind elsewhere. When night fell again, She found herself walking back to the flight line, drawn by instinct more than plan. And there he was. The pilot. He stood near the wing of a jet, clipboard in hand, his profile lit by the floodlights that bathed the tarmac in harsh white. His posture was rigid, focused, but his eyes looked far away, as if the night sky itself carried memories he couldn't escape. She hesitated in the shadows, her throat tight. What if he shut her out again? What if he refused to speak? But she couldn't leave. Not now. Not with the weight of unfinished words pressing against her ribs. Summoning what little courage she had, she stepped forward. He looked up, their eyes met. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he sighed, setting the clipboard aside. "You shouldn't be here." "I need to know," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but she forced it steady. "You said his story isn't finished. What does that mean?" He studied her, his gaze sharp, searching. "Finally," he said quietly, "it means there are things about your brother you've never been told. Things that can't be written in reports." Her chest tightened. "Then tell me." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" He looked at her for a long time, and in his silence, she felt the weight of something enormous pressing down. "Because if I tell you," he said at last, his voice low, "you won't just be carrying your brother's memory anymore. You'll be carrying his burden." The words sank into her, cold and heavy. She didn't fully understand them, not yet, but she knew enough to realize the choice before her. She could walk away, keep her brother as memory, as grief, as love unbroken by secrets. Or she could step forward, into shadows she wasn't sure she could bear. Her fists clenched at her sides. She thought of her mother's hollow eyes, her father's silence, the years of missing. She met his gaze, her voice steady now. "Then let me carry it." What would it cost her to hear the truth? The question hung in the air between them, heavier than the roar of engines warming up on the far side of the tarmac. He stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, as though bracing against a storm. She stood opposite him, small but unyielding, her sleeve burning with the weight of the patch. "Why do you want this?" he asked finally, his voice sharp, cutting through the night. "What do you think knowing will give you?" Her throat was dry, but she forced the words out. "I want to understand who he really was, not the silence, not the reports, not the empty words on paper. I need to know the truth." His eyes narrowed. "Truth isn't neat. It doesn't bring peace. Sometimes it takes more than it gives." She swallowed hard, then let it take. For a moment he only stared at her. She thought he might turn away, dismiss her as just another lost sibling searching for ghosts. But then his shoulders dropped slightly, and the hardness in his eyes flickered with something else. Resignation. "Fine," he said quietly, "but once you step into this you don't step back out. Understand?" She nodded, though her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break her ribs. He glanced around, making sure no one was near, then motioned for her to follow. They walked in silence, their boots echoing against the concrete until they reached a shadowed corner near the hangar. He leaned against the cold metal wall, his gaze fixed on the dark sky above. "Your brother wasn't supposed to be there that night," he began. His voice was low, steady, but she could feel the tension threaded through it. "The mission was already sealed. My squadron had our orders. He wasn't on the manifest. He wasn't even supposed to step on the bird." Her brow furrowed. "Then why was he there?" "That's the thing," he said, his jaw tightening. "He volunteered. No, more than that, he insisted. Something about the target, something about what was waiting on the ground. He said he couldn't sit this one out, that it mattered more than the paperwork." Her chest clenched. That sounded like him, reckless, stubborn, always stepping where he wasn't invited. "What was the mission?" she asked softly. His eyes shifted to her, sharp and unreadable. "You don't want the details." "Yes, I do." He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "All right, it was an extraction deep in hostile ground. A small team pinned down after intel went wrong. We weren't supposed to be anywhere near it, but command pushed it through. Risky, almost suicidal, but your brother, he didn't blink. He strapped in with the rest of us like he'd been there all along. Her breath caught. She could almost see it. Her brother climbing into the aircraft, his face set, eyes alive with that stubborn fire he always carried. "What happened?" she whispered. The pilot's gaze darkened. We landed under fire. The ground lit up around us. Tracers, mortars, everything you can imagine. We pulled in as close as we could, and the team came running through the dust, dragging one of their own. We should been gone in 60 seconds. He paused, his voice tightening. But then the RPG hit. Her heart lurched. Half the bay filled with smoke and fire. Chaos. Men shouting over comms, alarms screaming. I saw him, your brother, moving through it like he was untouchable. He grabbed one of the wounded, hauled him inside. He was the last to board. She felt her throat close, her hands trembling against her sides. But something went wrong, the pilot continued. His voice was quieter now, almost reluctant. The ramp jammed, wouldn't close, enemy fire tearing into the fuselage. I ordered everyone to strap in, but he stayed at the ramp trying to force it shut with his bare hands. And then he stopped, his eyes fell to the ground. And then her voice cracked. His jaw tightened, his silence stretching into the space between them. Finally, he said, "The last thing I saw was him standing in the smoke. The ramp closed, the aircraft lifted, but he wasn't on board." The words hit her like a physical blow. She staggered back a step, her breath ragged. Missing, the word from years ago thundered back into her ears. Missing. "You left him," she whispered, her voice trembling with anger, with grief, with disbelief. His eyes snapped up fierce. Don't you dare think it was that simple. If he hadn't done what he did, none of us would made it out alive. He chose to stay. He made that call." Tears burned her eyes. Her brother, stubborn, reckless, unyielding, had stood in the fire and given everything. But still, something didn't fit. Her voice was barely audible. "If that's all there was, why did you say his story isn't finished?" The pilot's gaze hardened again. For a moment she thought he might shut down, walk away. But instead he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because after we cleared the zone, after the chaos, I heard something. A fragment of comms. Garbled, broken through static, but it was his voice." Her heart lurched, his voice. He nodded slowly. "I don't know how, I don't know from where, but he said one thing before the channel cut." Her breath caught. What did he say? The pilot's eyes locked onto hers, steady, unwavering. "He said it's not over." The world seemed to tilt beneath her. Her knees weakened, her vision blurred with tears. She gripped the edge of the wall to steady herself, her chest heaving. "Not over." Her brother's last words. "Not over." The pilot straightened, his expression a mask of conflict. "That's why I can't give you peace, because I don't have it myself. We left him, but somewhere in that smoke he was still fighting, and no one has ever told me how that story ends." Silence pressed down like a weight. She tried to speak, but no words came, only the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. At last he said quietly, "Now you know what I carry, and now you have to decide if you'll carry it too." She closed her eyes, the tears finally spilling hot down her cheeks. Because deep inside, she already knew her answer. She would carry it. Whatever it meant. Whatever it cost. How do you live with words that refuse to die? She repeated them in her head like a prayer or maybe a curse. It's not over. The 3 words her brother had spoken, carried through smoke and static, reaching her years too late. She lay awake on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, the dormitory humming with the faint snores and shifting of the others. Sleep wouldn't come. Her brother's voice haunted her now, not in memory but in the possibility of survival. Could he have lived? Could he still be out there, forgotten by the system that labeled him missing in action and moved on? Her chest rose and fell with sharp, uneven breaths. She tried to push the thought away, but it dug in deeper. She thought of her mother's tired eyes, her father's silence. If there was even a chance that the story wasn't finished, didn't she owe it to them to know? The next morning, she found herself walking toward the records building again. She told herself it was just a habit, just a route across base, but her eyes lingered on the guarded door. She slowed, her boots crunching against the gravel, and stared. The guard met her gaze, his expression flat. She turned quickly, pretending to adjust her sleeve, and walked on. But the thought burned in her chest. The pilot's words had opened something she couldn't close. She needed more. That night after lights out, she slipped from her bunk and pulled on her jacket. The halls were quiet, the air cool. She moved carefully, her heart pounding at every creak of the floorboards. She knew the risks. Unauthorized access was more than just breaking rules. It was a career-ending offense. Maybe worse. But rules hadn't brought her brother home. Silence hadn't given her peace. She moved across the compound, the shadows stretching long under the floodlights. Every sound made her flinch. The distant rumble of engines, the echo of boots in the far distance, the soft clink of her dog tags against her chest. She reached the records building, her breath sharp as she crouched near the corner. The guard was there as always, but his focus wavered, his head dipping, his attention pulled to the phone glowing faintly in his hand. She hesitated, her palms slick with sweat. She wasn't a spy. She wasn't trained for this, but desperation made her reckless. She glanced around, her heart hammering, then slipped into the shadows along the side of the building. She didn't know how she would get in. Not yet. But just being there, close enough to smell the faint tang of paper and dust drifting from the vents, felt like a step toward something forbidden, something real. She froze when she heard footsteps. Not the guard, someone else. She pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath as a figure approached. The shape emerged from the dark and her chest seized. It was him. The pilot. His eyes found her instantly, narrowing with sharp recognition. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the silence stretched between them, heavy with accusation. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low, but it cut like a blade. She swallowed hard. I thought I could." "You thought you could what?" He stepped closer, his gaze fierce. "Sneak into classified records. You don't know what you're playing with." "I need to know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You told me his story isn't finished. I can't just sit here and pretend that doesn't matter." His jaw clenched. He looked at her the way someone looks at a cliff's edge, like he knew the fall would hurt, but he couldn't pull her back. "You're not ready for what you'll find in there," he said finally. Her throat tightened. "Then help me, don't let me do this alone." For a long time he said nothing. The night air carried the faint roar of a distant jet, the metallic clink of a chain swinging against a pole. His eyes studied hers, searching for something. Resolve, or maybe desperation. Finally he exhaled. "Fine, not here, not like this. Tomorrow night, meet me at Hangar 12. Her chest tightened. Relief and fear tangled in her stomach. She nodded, unable to find words. He turned sharply and walked away, his silhouette swallowed by the dark. She stayed frozen against the wall, her breath shaking. Hangar 12. Her brother's story wasn't finished. And tomorrow, she would take her next step into it. The following day dragged like chains. She moved through her duties in a haze, her hands automatic, her mind elsewhere. She could barely eat, barely hear the words around her. Every tick of the clock pulled her closer to the night. By the time the sun set, her nerves were raw. She slipped from the dorm quietly, every sound amplified in her ears. The path to the hangar was longer than she remembered, every shadow deeper, every noise sharper. When she reached it, she found the doors half open, the cavernous space inside lit by a single hanging bulb. The smell of oil and dust clung to the air. He was there waiting. The pilot stood near a workbench, his hands resting on a folder thick with papers. His expression was unreadable, caught between caution and something heavier. "You came," he said simply. She nodded, her chest tight. "You said you'd tell me." He studied her for a long moment. "What I'm about to show you isn't supposed to exist. If anyone finds out, it won't just be your career. It could be worse." Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze. "I don't care." He opened the folder. Inside were pages, reports, maps, photos blurred with static and smoke. Her hands shook as she reached for them. The first photo made her chest seize. It was grainy, black and white, but she recognized him, her brother. Standing at the edge of a landing zone, his face turned toward the camera, dust swirling around him. Alive, fierce, unyielding. Her breath caught. "This was taken minutes before the firefight," the pilot said quietly. "The last confirmed image of him on record." She traced the outline of his face with trembling fingers. Tears blurred her vision. But then her eyes caught something else in the frame. A symbol painted on a wall behind him. Not military, not familiar, something strange, something foreign. "What's that?" she whispered. The pilot's jaw tightened. That's why his story isn't finished. Her pulse hammered. She looked up at him, searching his face for answers. "What does it mean?" He closed the folder, his hand firm on the cover. "It means your brother wasn't lost to the fire. He was taken." Her blood ran cold. "Taken?" The word hollowed her chest, leaving only a sharp, burning resolve. Her brother hadn't just vanished. He hadn't just been a casualty of chaos. He had been pulled into something darker, something hidden. And now she knew she couldn't stop. Not until she found out where that path led. What if the truth was worse than losing him? The thought gnawed at her as she stared at the folder the pilot had just closed, her reflection faintly visible in its slick cover. Her pulse hammered, her palms damp against her thighs. She wanted to rip it open again, to demand every page, every detail. But the weight in his eyes stopped her. "Taken." The word throbbed in her chest like a bruise. Her brother hadn't been swallowed by fire. He hadn't been reduced to silence and smoke. Someone had pulled him from it. Someone had wanted him alive. "Who?" she whispered, the word trembling from her lips. The pilot exhaled slowly, leaning against the workbench, his gaze fixed on the dark floor. "That's the question no one wants to ask. The official story is clean. A lost soldier. A casualty of chaos. Easier to bury it that way." Her voice rose, sharp with anger. "Then why did you keep this?" She tapped the folder with her fingertip, her breath shaking. "Why do you still have it?" His jaw clenched. He met her eyes. "Because I was there. Because I can't erase what I saw. And because when I hear his voice in my dreams, I can't accept silence as an answer." Her throat tightened. She had lived with silence too, long nights curled against herself, mornings where the world went on as if he had never existed. And now, in front of her, was the first crack in the wall. "Tell me everything," she said. He hesitated, his gaze steady, weighing her resolve. Finally, he nodded. There were rumors even before that night. Whispers about a group operating outside the lines. Not enemy, not ally, ghosts in the dark. They didn't just fight battles, they took people, specialists, operatives, anyone they thought had value. Her breath quickened. "And you think my brother—" "I don't think," he cut in softly. "I know, he was targeted. The symbol you saw in that photo, it's theirs. I've seen it before. Once, years earlier, etched onto a wall in a burned-out compound. And then again on the edge of another mission that went wrong. Each time, someone disappeared." She felt her knees weaken, her hand grasping at the workbench for balance. Her brother targeted, taken. The image of him, strong and laughing, carrying her on his shoulders when she was a child, collided with the thought of him dragged into the shadows by hands she couldn't see. "Why him?" she asked, her voice breaking. The pilot's eyes softened, though his voice remained steady. "Because he was more than you knew, More than any of us knew, maybe. He had something they wanted, and they don't take what they can't use. Tears stung her eyes. She pressed her hand against her mouth, her breath uneven. She had always thought of him as her big brother, reckless, stubborn, protective. But now the picture widened. What else had he been? What had he carried that others wanted badly enough to steal him from the fire? She lowered her hand, her voice hoarse. Why hasn't anyone told us? Why hide it? His silence answered before his words came. Because admitting it would mean admitting there's something bigger at play, something they can't control, and no one in command wants to open that door. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, a cover-up, a shadow enemy, a brother stolen into darkness. Her voice trembled. So what happens now? He looked at her carefully, his expression unreadable. That depends on you. You asked for the truth. Now you've got enough of it to tear your world apart. You can walk away. Pretend this never happened. Carry your brother as memory. She shook her head, her fists curling. I can't, not now, not after this. He studied her, a faint trace of something like respect flickering in his eyes. But there was caution too, like he was watching a spark near dry grass. Then you need to understand something, he said. His voice was low, deliberate. If you keep going, you'll find pieces of him in places you don't want to see. You'll find shadows that make you question whether you even knew who he was. And you won't be able to stop. Not until you've either burned everything down or lost yourself in the dark. Her breath shook, but her voice was steady. Then I'll risk it. The pilot closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling like a man surrendering to inevitability. When he opened them, there was resolve. Then you'll need to see more than photos. He reached into the folder, pulling out a single page, a map, lines and coordinates, circles marked in red. This is where it happened, he said, pointing to a barren stretch of terrain etched with faint rivers. But there's another mark here, about 20 miles east, a signal picked up days after the mission. Weak, almost dismissed, but I traced it, and it carried the same code your brother used on secure comms. Her eyes widened. He was alive. He nodded slowly. Alive, at least long enough to send that signal. After that, nothing. She reached out, her fingers brushing the paper, her heart hammering. 20 miles east. A place on the map she had never heard of, but now it burned into her mind like fire. Why didn't anyone follow it? She asked, her voice sharp. Because the report was buried, classified, written off as interference. Easier to say he was gone than to admit the possibility that he was. Her stomach churned. Anger flared in her chest, hot and sharp. Years of grief, of silence, of her family living with half-truths, all of it because someone chose convenience over courage. She clenched her fists. Then I'll find it myself. The pilot's eyes narrowed. You don't understand. This isn't something you can walk into. If you even whisper about it, doors will close around you. People will make sure you stay silent. Then why are you telling me? She demanded. His jaw tightened. He looked away, his voice quiet. Because I've been carrying it alone too long, and because maybe you deserve to know the man your brother really was, even if the truth breaks you. Her chest ached, but her voice was steady. It won't break me. Silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. Finally, he folded the map, slid it back into the folder, and handed it to her. Then keep this, he said, but guard it, because once you open it again, once you let yourself follow what's on those pages, there's no turning back. She took it with trembling hands, her heart pounding. The folder was heavier than it should been, not with paper, but with the weight of what it meant. She pressed it against her chest, her breath shaky. For years she had carried a patch. Now she carried a map. And for the first time, the road ahead wasn't just grief, it was possibility. Terrifying, dangerous, but possibility. She looked up at him, her eyes burning with determination. Then show me how to follow it. His gaze lingered on her, steady and unreadable. And then with a slow nod he said, all right, but understand this, Once you start down this path, you won't be the same person when it ends. Her throat tightened. She thought of her brother's voice faint through static, "It's not over." Maybe he hadn't been speaking only for himself. Maybe those words were meant for her too. What if following the map destroyed what little she had left of him? The thought pressed on her chest as she sat on her bunk, the folder heavy in her lap. The dormitory was quiet, save for the faint rustle of someone turning in their sleep. Her fingers traced the crease in the paper, the red circles burned into her mind. 20 miles east. A signal, a possibility. She should have felt relief. She should have clung to hope. Instead, she felt the weight of a choice that threatened to hollow her out. She thought of her mother, sitting by the window each evening as if waiting for footsteps that would never return. She thought of her father, hands stained with grease and silence, lost in the garage with tools instead of words. They had lived with the ache of missing. What would it do to them if she uncovered something darker? What if her brother hadn't died a hero at all, but something else? Her breath trembled. The pilot's warning echoed. Once you start down this path, you won't be the same person when it ends. But maybe that was already true. Maybe she had changed the moment she stepped into the briefing room with coffee and a patch that refused to be ignored. She pressed her hand against the sleeve, feeling the threads beneath her palm. Her brother had carried weight heavier than she had ever known. Maybe this was hers now. She opened the folder again. The map unfolded across her knees, faint lines and faded ink stretching toward the red circle 20 miles east of the mission site. She stared at it until her vision blurred, the lines becoming pathways, the circle burning like an ember. Her heart whispered, "Go." The next day she found herself moving differently, quieter, more deliberate. She watched the pilots as they prepared their aircraft, listened more closely in the mess hall to snippets of conversation, noted the schedules of guards without even meaning to. Her body moved through routine, but her mind was elsewhere, already charting routes, already imagining the terrain beyond the map. By evening, she found herself back in the hangar with him. The pilot stood near the wing of a jet, his arms crossed, watching her approach. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he already knew the choice she'd made. "You opened it," he said. She nodded. "I can't walk away now." His jaw tightened. "Then you need to understand what you're asking for. That place," he tapped the map, his finger landing on the red circle, "isn't just a dot in the desert. It's buried under layers of things you can't imagine. If we go, we don't go as officers or soldiers. We go as shadows, and shadows don't get rescued." Her chest tightened, but her voice was steady. "Then teach me how to be one." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp, measuring. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "You remind me of him," he said quietly. Her throat caught. "That's why I have to do this." For the first time, a flicker of something softer passed across his face. Respect, maybe, or resignation. "All right," he said, "then we plan." The days that followed blurred into a rhythm unlike anything she had known. She met him in quiet corners of the hangar, under the cover of night, or in the hum of early morning when the base was half asleep. He showed her things she had only glimpsed in training manuals, the way to move unseen, the way to read terrain not just as lines on a map but as living ground, the way to listen for patterns in silence. At first she stumbled. Her boots scraped too loud. Her breath gave her away. She grew frustrated, tears threatening when her body failed her. But he was patient, his voice calm, steady. "You're learning what most people never will," he told her. "It's not about strength. It's about quiet, about knowing when to be still." She carried his words with her, practicing even in the dormitory, holding her breath, moving from shadow to shadow as if the walls themselves were watching. She became quieter, sharper, more deliberate. But with each step the weight grew. At night, lying awake, she wondered what she was becoming. Was this who her brother would want her to be, or was she chasing a ghost she would never catch? The doubt clawed at her. One night she confessed it. Standing in the hangar, her voice low, she said, "What if I'm wrong? What if all I find out there is emptiness? What if I lose myself for nothing?" The pilot looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "I asked myself that same question once, and the answer was this: sometimes it's not about what you find. It's about proving you were willing to look." The words sank into her, heavy, true. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Then I'll look," she whispered. When the night came, it came quiet. The base slept under a moonless sky, the stars cold and sharp above. She slipped from her bunk, her jacket pulled tight, the folder pressed against her chest. Her heart pounded, but her movements were steady now. He was waiting near the edge of the tarmac, a small pack slung over his shoulder, his posture rigid in the dark. He handed her a pack of her own, lighter, but filled with essentials she hadn't thought to gather. "From here on," he said softly, "there's no turning back." She nodded, "I know." They moved across the base like shadows, silent, deliberate. She matched his pace, her breath steady, her steps light. The map was folded in her pocket, the red circle burning in her mind like a beacon. At the perimeter he paused, scanning the dark. Then, with a quick motion, he signaled her forward. They slipped beyond the fence into the night, the base shrinking behind them. Every step into the dark felt like stepping off the edge of the world. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel lost. She felt pulled. Toward the circle, toward the echo of her brother's voice. Toward the unfinished story waiting in the shadows. What do you do when the silence finally breaks? The desert stretched endless before them, a barren sea of dust and shadow. Every step crunched against gravel, the cold air biting their faces. The base had vanished behind them hours ago, replaced only by the steady rhythm of boots and breath, the stars fixed above like watchful eyes. She clutched the folded map in her pocket, the red circle burned into her mind. 20 miles east. Somewhere out here, her brother's story had left its last mark. The pilot walked ahead, his silhouette steady, a compass in the dark. She followed, her body aching but her resolve unshaken. Each mile stripped something from her, fear, doubt, hesitation, until only determination remained. When dawn touched the horizon, they reached the ridge. He stopped, raising his hand, his gaze scanning the ground below. "There," he said quietly. She followed his eyes. In the valley below lay ruins. Half-buried walls of crumbling stone, twisted metal scattered across the sand, the ghost of a compound long abandoned. Her breath caught. The symbol. Faint, faded, but still visible, etched onto a wall, the same one from the photograph. Her heart pounded. They descended carefully, the sand shifting underfoot. The air was thick with silence, the kind that pressed against your chest. She moved slowly, her hand brushing the cold stone as they entered the remains. Inside, shadows clung to corners. The air smelled of rust and dust, as if time itself had rotted. She ran her fingers over the wall, tracing the symbol. The lines cut deep, sharp even after years. "This is where he was taken," the pilot said, his voice low. Her throat tightened. She imagined him here, her brother, alive, defiant, dragged into the dark. She could almost hear his voice, faint but steady. "It's not over." She turned sharply. If he was taken, where did they take him? The pilot hesitated, his gaze shifting. "That's the question no one answered. Reports say nothing. Files are empty. But sometimes," he paused, his jaw tightening, "sometimes men came back with whispers about camps, about experiments, about soldiers broken down and rebuilt for reasons no one dared to name." Her chest clenched. The image of her brother, laughing, carrying her on his shoulders, collided with the thought of him in chains, remade into something unrecognizable. Tears stung her eyes. She pressed her palms against her face, the sob breaking through despite her fight. He stood silently beside her, letting her grief echo through the hollow space. When she lowered her hands, her voice was raw. "Why didn't anyone come for him?" The pilot's eyes darkened, because sometimes the truth is too costly. Sending men after one soldier risks dozens more. Command chose silence, and I obeyed. She looked at him, anger flaring. You left him. His jaw tightened, pain flickered across his face. I know, and I'll carry that for the rest of my life. Her fists trembled, but as the heat of anger burned, it left something else in its place. Not blame, not vengeance. Resolve. She stepped deeper into the ruin, her eyes scanning the floor. Something glinted faintly in the sand. She crouched, brushing it free. A tag. Her breath froze. It was his. Her brother's dog tag, half buried, the chain rusted but intact. She held it in her trembling hands, the letters etched deep. His name, his number, his blood type. Her throat closed, tears blurred her vision. For years she had lived with nothing but silence. Now here in the dust was proof. Proof that he had been here. Proof that he had fought. Proof that his story hadn't ended in fire. She clutched it to her chest, her body shaking with the weight of it. The pilot knelt beside her, his voice quiet. Sometimes what's left behind is all we get, but sometimes it's enough. She shook her head, her tears falling freely now. It's not enough. He deserved more. He deserved to be remembered for what he gave, for who he was. The pilot's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. And now he will be, because you came, because you refused silence. She closed her eyes, breathing through the ache. When she opened them again, the desert stretched wide and unyielding around her. The ruins stood still, holding secrets no one else would ever uncover. But in her hand, the tag glinted in the morning light, warm against her palm. Her brother's voice echoed again in her memory. It's not over. She rose slowly, her legs steady, her shoulders squared. She looked at the pilot, her voice steady despite the tears. Then it's not over for me either. He met her gaze, and for the first time his eyes softened. Not as a soldier to a subordinate, not as a witness to a sister, but as one burdened soul to another. They left the ruin together, the tag pressed to her chest, the map folded away. The desert swallowed their footsteps, but not the weight of what they carried. As they reached the ridge again, she paused, turning back one last time. The ruins stood silent but no longer empty. Her brother lived there now, in the dust, in the silence, in the courage it had taken to leave everything behind. And in her. She breathed deeply, the air sharp and cold. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it doesn't shout. It simply acts. She walked on, the sun rising behind her, the tag clutched tight in her hand. And though the story wasn't finished, for the first time she was ready to carry it forward.